going live now, and so we're all ready for you, Professor Stubblefield, to get us
Excellent.
started.
Excellent. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for
Going
the
live now, and
Pasadena City College Summer Creative Writing Academy. A special thank you to the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors who generously fund this and other visiting writer programs for the Creative Writing Program for PCC. So, welcome. I am Professor Stubblefield, and this is Dr. Kirsten Ogden, and that is our visiting writer, Lori Ostlund. And I'm honored to introduce her today. I'm not exactly sure what Lori has on tap, but let me talk a little bit about her most recent book, the short story collection, Are You Happy? Nine exquisite stories that explore class, desire, identity, and the specter of violence that looms daily over women and the LGBTQ plus community. Lori's novel After the Parade um, was a Barnes& and Noble Discover pick and a finalist for the Center of Fiction First Novel Prize and the Farrell Grumley Award. Her story collection, The Bigness of the World, won the 2008 Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction, the first California Book Award for First Fiction, and the Edmund White Debut Fiction Award, and was a Lambada finalist in the New York Times Editor's Choice. Amazing for that first story collection. Lori's work has appeared in Best American Short Stories, which is a fabulous series that happens every year, and the Penn O. Henry Prize stories, as well as in Ziziva, the Kenyon Review, the New England Review, and other journals. Lori has received a Rona Jaffe Foundation Award and a fellowship to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and was a finalist for the 2017 Joyce Carol Oates Prize. She has been a teacher for over 25 years in New Mexico, Spain, Malaysia, and North Carolina, and is currently on the Mile High MFA faculty at Regis University in Denver. She is the series editor of the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction and a board member of the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, which supports feminist women in the arts. Please, let's give a big welcome to Lori Ostlund.
yay, Lori!
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, Professor Stubblefield, for that wonderful introduction. I'm no longer actually on the Regis Mile High MFA faculty because they last year, in the way of such things, laid everyone off.
Wow.
You
That's
know,
right. Oh, that's
yeah, but everything else is more or less accurate. And it's so nice to be here with everybody. So I was telling your professors just now that I had one idea for what I wanted to talk to you about today, and then woke up this morning thinking about something else entirely. And I'm changing my speaker mode. Basically, what happened this morning was that I sat down. So I just came from a month-long book tour. And the form that that book tour took was kind of interesting because I decided that it was a nice time to be out in the world and checking on friends. And so my wife and I devised what we called the Friends and Book Tour. And we drove over 7,000 miles all over the country, staying with friends to see how they were doing and doing book events along the way. And I sort of wondered what will be the hardest part of this. Will it be driving over 7,000 miles? Will it be staying with friends? Or will it be the book stuff? The book stuff was great. The driving, I love to drive. The driving was great. But staying with friends was at times hard, not because of the friends, but because there is a lot going on out there. Um, and so after being very much out in the world and talking about my book, which is a really public thing, I then came home, and my next book is due a year from now. And I came home and I have been sitting at my desk trying to figure out how to go back into a very private world, the world of writing. And this morning, as I was sitting there trying to do this, um, I started thinking some more about what I would talk to you all about today. And I started thinking about a question also that I get a lot, which is really this question of where ideas come from and how does all of that work? And so I thought I would come at it in a couple of different directions. I'm going to, at some point, read to you a little bit from one of my stories in the new book and talk a little bit about where that came from. And I want to make room for questions because I don't think any of us come up with ideas in the same way. I don't think that there's just one way to do it. Um, but I'm going to, and I speak in terms of stories. I think in terms of stories, and I think in terms of details and in terms of examples. I like theory and occasionally read theoretical things, but my brain prefers stories. I love nothing better than to sit down with people and have them tell me stories. Um, so I thought I would start by telling you a story that maybe tells you something about me and how I came to think about writing. So I grew up in a town of 400 people in Minnesota, very rural. My parents owned a hardware store, and we just did not leave that town. We went away once a year, and that was for the hardware convention. It was in the Twin Cities. We drove there and we drove back. Otherwise, we were in the hardware store. And so much of what I learned about writing, how I think about dialogue, happened in that hardware store because I was very shy. And so my default was observation, listening when, especially when people didn't know that I was listening. And what I came to understand was that the most interesting things are the things that don't get said. They're the things, the moment where people are speaking and stop. And then often there's a pause, and then they pick up somewhere different. It seems somewhere different. And for me, thinking about what happened in the pause, that they all understood what that silence meant, was something I thought about a lot. So fast forward several years, and I went away to college. My parents had not gone to college, but they were determined that all five of us should go to college. And so we all went 2 hours down the road to a state school in Moorhead, Minnesota. It was right on the border with the better known city of Fargo, North Dakota. And people know it because of the movie Fargo and the follow-up television show Fargo. And people always assume Fargo's in Minnesota. It's actually in North Dakota. So I went to this state college, and when I was around 20, I bought my first car. And I was very shy, but I found that I was really curious about people. And so I have often done a lot of stupid things in my life. And one of the stupid things that I did was that I used to go out driving at night, picking up hitchhikers. And so I would just drive around this twin city and pick up people and take them wherever they needed to go. So mainly, I picked up a lot of drunk college students and took them home, right? And so they would sit in the backseat and talk, and I would be in the front, and I was just, a taxi driver, except I didn't get paid for it. Once I picked up an elderly man who was looking in the store of a liquor store that was closed. The liquor store is closed earlier in Minnesota than they did in North Dakota. And I took him across the state border to a liquor store, and he bought a bunch of whiskey, and I drove him home. And another time I picked up a woman, and it was clear that something terrible had happened to her. And I didn't know what to say to her. She got in and she sat, her shirt was torn, and she sat in the passenger seat with her head against the door and cried. And I was very young. I had no idea what to say to her. I had, at a certain point, understood I'd always been interested in math. Everyone assumed I would do something with math. And at a certain point, I understood that I wanted something quite different from that. Um, and so I had started to carry a small tape recorder in the glove compartment. It wasn't on, I wasn't taping people, but I thought that I would hear something, that people would tell me something that would make me a writer, that they would tell me a story and I would know what to do with it. And that when they got out of the car, I would take out the tape recorder and record this story, and that would lead to a writing career. And nothing ever happened, right? It was many years later that I actually became a writer. But I think a great deal about where stories come from, where ideas come from. And I keep a series of notebooks, right? I just pulled one out to read to you from today. I keep notebooks because for me, what I've realized is that stories come from the odd details, a line that someone will say, and I think I've got to remember that. Something I overhear. And so I'm going to talk about some of those examples a little bit and maybe give a writing prompt later on. But what happened this morning specifically as I was trying to write and failing at it, which is often the case, is that I saw a newspaper headline. And the newspaper headline, I wrote it down in my notebook because I'm interested in it. The newspaper headline said this: swatting cases are rising rapidly in the Bay Area. I had no idea what swatting is. Is there anybody in there that out there that knows what swatting is? Because this was a new term to me. Anybody? Okay. So it turns out that
Yeah, I do.
someone,
I'm sorry.
someone knows.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, I see you put it in a fake call to 911 that
Yeah,
brings.
essentially, yeah.
Yes, I was fascinated by this. I had no idea that. So it's basically when you make a fake call and call in a SWAT team, you say that there's like a kidnapping or some sort of a hostage situation, and the police come in. This was interesting to me because the book that I'm now working on, this novel, involves a SWAT situation. And so I'm always happy when two pieces of my life collide, when I'm reading the news and it collides with what I'm trying to write. And I'm writing about a SWAT situation because years ago, this book is set in the a furniture store that my wife and I owned in Albuquerque, New Mexico years ago. We owned this furniture store for 7 years. And things happened while we had that store. And one of the things that happened was that one day I looked out the window and I saw the entire street. We were in a very busy intersection. No cars, nobody on it. And so I'm standing at the door and I realized that there's a SWAT team, police everywhere on top of buildings, and that they in fact have the intersection barricaded and the guns pointing at this, kind of fly-by-night motel. And that I am standing so that if the person that they are pointing their guns at shoots back, I am in the direct line of fire. Yeah, nobody had told us that we should be on lockdown. And so this is, we ended up having to go into hiding. We spent the whole day hiding in the back of our store while this SWAT situation with the helicopters overhead, because a man who lived in that motel had gone up the street and stabbed another store owner in the stomach 6 or 7 times. And so the SWAT situation is something that I'm thinking about. And then this article pops up. And I had no idea that SWAT situations were something that people called in. And suddenly I started to think, is it a real SWAT situation that's going in my book, or is it a fake situation, right? And immediately my brain starts playing with it. It's the sort of thing that I needed. And all of a sudden I thought, I'm going to talk about ideas. I'm going to talk about where ideas come from, where my ideas come from. Any thoughts or questions at this point, or anyone want to kind of toss out, where do your ideas come from? Or how is it that when you sit down with a blank page, because it is the question I get the most often. There are two questions I get. Where do ideas come from in general? And where did this story come from specifically?
Feel free, everybody, if you want to unmute yourself to share, or you can put something in the chat and I can read it for
Yeah,
you.
this time I promise I'll look at the chat. I always forget to look at it.
I was going to say, Lori, I mean, I think like you were mentioning, you know, keeping a notebook, like that's definitely something I do. And of course, one of our shared mentors, Nancy Zafras, used to have us carry around index cards or like little things that we could write down a little sentence or scratch a dialogue or note or experience or great character name or whatever else would pop
Yeah.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, great character names are, I mean, I'm always Professor Stubblefield. As soon as I met you, I was like, wow, you have a great last name, right? That sort of name, it's so resonant. Don't worry, I'm not going to steal it, but I'm always
You can have it.
really? I love it. I love it. I always feel kind of apologetic because when I hear a name that just, it sounds so great. Anyone have
Yeah, go
one?
ahead, Angel.
Yeah, so in this class, I guess I always knew I was a really like anxious person, and introspective, but whenever I write now, it's usually about myself. I don't know if that's like a good thing or a bad thing. But whenever I start writing, it always starts with like an emotion. It's usually tied to some sort of like inner conflict or like conflict between like how I feel and like what's going on in the world. So it seems like most of my work is based on like emotions that I want to portray.
Yeah, yeah. I, and that is a really hard thing to get down on the page, isn't it? Because emotion is, I always feel like when I'm dealing with emotion, I've got to figure out a way to come in through the back door. Because if I just write down, I'm sad or I'm mad or I'm right, it's how I feel. But I don't know, it doesn't take in terms of thinking about a reader or where I'm going with it next, it doesn't take me anywhere. And so emotion, in fact, was the first thing. You can't see my post-it, but at the very top of this, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was emotion, like when I'm feeling something and how I come at it, or the ideas that kind of feed to that. And so under emotion, I had written down two things that I found in my notebook that then led to something else. Um, and they became tools for me, I guess, to kind of explore an emotion that a character was feeling. The first of these ended up in one of the stories in my current collection, the title story, Are You Happy? And it was a story that someone told me years ago. My wife's family and her father was Russian, and he had helped to get a lot of his Russian relatives out of the Soviet Union years ago. And so one of them, her cousin, who was quite a bit older, came to stay with us with her husband and her best friend. And they told me a story at dinner that night that the two women, the two best friends, had gone to Spain. And my wife was living there at the time. They'd visited her and then they'd gone to one of the vacation spots. And they had the friend's son with them, who was a grown man. And as they were leaving, the plane took off and it fell back. And at that time, people smoked on planes, right? Some of us remember the days of people smoking on planes. The smokers were generally seated in the back, which meant that when the plane fell backwards, the smokers were the ones who died. And so the two women who were telling me this and their son were not smokers, but the rest of their friends were, and they died. So the three of them who survived were taken to an airport hotel. And all of this, the details of this story, I was really interested in. But the image that I couldn't shake was they told me that they all got into this king-size bed, all three of them, and they were just shaking. And they stayed in that bed for 3 days, just stayed in the bed. And so you're talking, Angel, about emotion. For me, that image, there was so much caught up in that image of loss and grief and I couldn't get rid of it. So I wrote it in my notebook. But sometimes I don't know. I'm not ready to write about something yet. I don't know the way in. I don't know what it's about, or maybe I'm just emotionally not ready to. But I didn't want to forget it. I knew that someday I would write about that story. So several years passed, and I was flying somewhere for a writers' conference, and I hate flying. So I engaged in sort of some irrational thinking, which was that if I wrote a story about a plane crash on the plane, there was no way that the plane could crash, because how could a plane crash while someone is sitting on it writing a story about a plane crashing? So I had a little notebook and I wrote this very quick story about a plane crash that was based on this story that Gita had told me. And then again, I put it away. And years later, I came across it, and it was suddenly, I guess, my emotion, the emotional space that I was in, matched what that story was about. And I suddenly knew what to do with that story. So that is the kind of the first idea but that notebook saved me, because you can have a story that stays with that means a lot to you, but unless I write it down, I have to have it in this notebook, and then every couple of weeks I just go through the notebook. If I'm stuck, I just look at it and I see, like, oh, I know what to, even when I was thinking about talking to you today, I found myself circling things like, oh, maybe I know what to do with that now. That's been in there for years. So emotion, thank you, Angel, for putting that out there. Other thoughts from people, like ideas, what you do when you sit down and you're trying, because it's daunting to sit down and have an idea. Come on, write something, have an idea.
There wasn't anything else in the chat, except Allie wanted to hear how you came up with the idea for the gap year.
Oh, the
Pretty
gap
good
year.
story. Yeah.
Yeah. So the gap year was a story that story took me so long. Oh my God. I think I wrote that story. That might be the earliest story in the collection, and it took me forever. I put it away for years. I didn't know how to end it. And that's another thing that my notebook sometimes, I'll go back and I'll be like, oh, that idea, I could work with that. But the gap year, one of the kind of seeds, I guess, of that story was something that someone told me that her her friend's son had been doing a gap year, and he was in Thailand with his friends, and a motor fell into the swimming pool where they were hanging out, and he was electrocuted. And so this whole idea of a gap year, and you think of that as being something that's meant to kind of celebrate life, it's this almost rite of passage before the next big thing and and so I just started thinking about that whole idea of the gap year. And so for me, when I see one piece, one idea start to move toward another idea, that's what I'm always looking for, at least with fiction. Like, oh, they don't seem like they belong together, but they're drawn to each other. And so the other thing that I had written down in my notebook was something that happened years ago. My wife and I taught in Malaysia for a couple of years. And at the end of that, we spent a month in Indonesia and a month in Thailand. And when we were my sister was with us, and when we were in Thailand, we took a boat out one day just to go snorkeling, and it was a boat with maybe a speedboat with maybe like 15 people on board. And on the way back, this storm came like that out of nowhere. And so we're going, and everyone's throwing up. It was just, I had back spasms for days because it was just bouncing like this up and down. And at a certain point, we saw this boat that was stopped, just riding the waves. And they had had engine trouble. They couldn't go anywhere. And there were all these people on board. And so the driver of our boat did not want to go to, because we were already at capacity and it's a storm, but we couldn't leave these people there. And so we're trying to make room for them. And they had, at a certain point, it became clear that the people from that boat, as the boats are doing this, that the people from that boat had to perch on the edge and leap into our boat. And the people in our boat and the people in that boat were holding hands. We couldn't tie them because they would have smashed together. So we're just holding hands. And then the guys would say, let go, because the waves were coming and they would have, they had to let go. And this man passed his baby across just as the waves came and they let go. And someone on our ship just grabbed the baby, and which would have fallen. So as I was thinking of it, I thought the gap, like this is all, I just found myself thinking gap, that baby almost fell into a gap, right? And so those two pieces just started, Thailand was on my head, but those two pieces started moving together. This young man who had lost his life in Thailand on a gap year, and then this whole crazy thing that I had watched. And I thought, yeah, that was where the story started, was really with these ideas and then, I'd go to my notebook, and a friend had said that her husband, the only way that he could kind of calm himself was folding origami. And so suddenly I thought, yeah, that makes sense, right? Just the kind of steadiness and precision of doing that. And so that started to work its way. And so sometimes it's small pieces. I'll go to it and I'll think, who is this character? Let me figure it out. And there'll just be something, right? I mean, that's always the best, when you go to your notebook and you're like, okay, he folds origami. And what does that mean? And how can that develop the character? Are there some stuff coming in the chats? I feel like there is.
There's a couple things, and I'll just read them since the writer. So there's a couple questions are coveted now, right? But John says writes a single word that is heard over and over, and that sometimes helps.
Oh,
Jenny wanted to know how many ideas or works maybe you've forgotten that were collected in your notebooks that you look back to, whether they were scrapped or you were thinking
yeah.
might use them later. And then Logan was saying, I usually find myself daydreaming or stuck on a certain thought and it bothers me for days, the realization of why the thought bothers me becomes my story or idea for a story. Maybe it's just a character that is there. So
I love
that's
that. I
that's
love that.
many agreeing about the spacing out and how those good ideas can come
Yeah.
with. And then last week we had poet Andrew Grace
Mhm.
with us. And one of the questions is last week we talked with a writer who said he doesn't like to sit down with an idea when he's going to write, but instead likes the ideas to come to him as he's writing. Do you
Yeah.
sit down to write with an idea about what you're going to write? So good. So more is coming
Yeah.
up.
These are all great. First of all, I'm very curious about this idea of the word. The person who said that they write one word, and that, I mean, I love that idea. I don't know if that person is a poet or if there's just something about the way the word sounds that resonates, but certainly that. Yeah, last year I went on vacation and I had been working a lot. I just been working a lot, and what I realized when I was on vacation was that my brain finally had kind of the leisure to just play with ideas, to just kind of, you know, how that happens, like where you just play with ideas in your head and you make jokes. And I was reminded again of just how important that is, you know, and I always believed I was lucky um, that I grew up kind of in this place where I had to entertain myself a lot because that having to entertain yourself does so much, I think, for the playfulness of the mind. There was one that I wanted to go back to, oh, sitting down with an idea and writing about that idea. Um, no, I usually have no idea what I'm going to write about when I sit down, other than I maybe have this sort of thing that I want to play with. But in fact, I find that if I know people often think, you know, that writers come with this concept, the whole premise kind of played out. I don't. I'm not one of those writers. And in fact, I find that sometimes if I know too much about a story, that's not good either. I will give you an example that actually was in my notebook that led to a story. And this was something my brother told me. My brother said, I come from a family of teachers. We all pretty much, my older brother ended up doing stuff with money, but the rest of us were all teachers. And so several years ago, my younger brother and his wife, both teachers, were visiting us, and we're both teachers. So we talk a lot about teaching when they're visiting. And my brother had what I would call the thankless job of being a middle school math teacher. And it's just, I mean, it's just like when I think of what could be worse, middle school math teacher. But that's what he was. And so he told us this story. He had a colleague, and so, you know, middle school kids, like that's a restless time. You're trying to figure out who you are in your body. Anyway, he had this very serious colleague who also taught, you know, like eighth grade math. And this colleague, when the boys would be like kind of roughhousing during class, he would move their desks together and he would make them hold hands through the rest of the class. And I was so flipped out by this because I was like, oh my God. And so I wrote it down immediately. But I said to my brother, because he, you know, he said, I can tell you about, you know, all about this guy. And I said, you know what? Actually, don't. Don't tell me anything more. Like why that acts on my brain is for me to think about. Like the story is not, I have to figure this out. So that's the sort of thing to kind of go back to this comment about the person last week. That's the sort of thing that I might like to come to it with, but I have to have something really specific kind of going in. That's why this whole idea of the word really captures me, right? Just a detail, something that will then take me into the work and to figure out, you know, in that case, that story, um, I started to think about, well, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean about this teacher that he makes the boys hold hands? Like, what is it in him that feels like a punishment, that shame of two boys holding hands, that's shameful to him? And at the same time, at the time I was teaching ESL, English as a second language here in San Francisco. My students were wonderful, and every day they told me things that I came down home and wrote down. But one of my students was this Brazilian guy, and he had come to the United States because he was an airline pilot. And the opportunities in Brazil at that time were not great. So he decided that he wanted to work in China as a pilot, because big country, lots of opportunity for pilots. But what he didn't have was English. So he ended up in my class, and he was just very serious about learning English. But one day he came in and he seemed really shaken. And so I asked them about their weekends, and he told me that weekend his friend, also a pilot from pilot school back in Brazil, had gone up with someone else, and a bird hit the windshield, if that's what it's called on a plane, I guess, windshield, and it shattered the windshield, which I did not know could happen. I mean, it was a small plane. And they were able to get it down, but his friend was blinded by the glass. And so he was a pilot who ended up blinded by a freak accident. And so I wrote it down in my notebook, and that became, I mean, that story, just every time I would open my notebook, I would think, that's part of understanding this man. This is part of understanding this man. And it all started from this thing that my brother told me about a colleague he was annoyed by, and trying to understand who that person was. Okay, I see somebody said, Sierra says, I usually get my ideas from experiences I can relate to that I can write about, or I will get my ideas from something I find inspiring. Yeah, that I think, well, I know it's hard to raise hands because people are, but I'm guessing that there are a lot of people out there. I know, Angel, you said that also in the beginning, that you start in a very personal place. And I think that a lot of us do. So much of my work starts in that very personal place. And I have to, at a certain point, make a decision. If I keep writing what just happened, right? If I just keep going with, well, and then this happened, and this happened, and then this happened, it's as though I'm walking down a hallway and the doors just shut in my brain, right? I become more and more locked into the reality of the situation. And I'm interested in, I have to believe, I guess, as a fiction writer, that it 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 caught something in my brain, and I need to figure out what that is. I need to figure out how to get that truth on the page. And it doesn't exist just by retelling what happened. So my rule, I start with a lot of stuff. Like Sierra, I start with a lot of stuff, with what really happened. And then I say, now what's something that did not happen at all? What is some way that I can change this completely and take it in a whole other direction? So that I figure out, like, what's the real story I'm trying to tell. Looking to see if there are I have to see and feel the scene. That's what Professor Stubblefield said. To write it, I don't have to know where it goes, but it needs to feel, yes, yeah. And Dr. Ogden, sometimes if I know the story and start writing, then it's kind of boring to finish it. Exactly. So it's nice to know. Yes, knowing too much about what you want can set high, unattainable expectations. I mean, I think we all know it's what we love about writing is that moment where your brain just does something, gives you an idea, and you start to see all the connections being made. Another, one of the details I came across when I was reading, it was a whole page that I'd written down, notes that I'd taken. And there was a story in my last collection called All Boy. I had no idea how to end the story. I mean, that's often the case. And for me, endings are the worst thing. Um, Dr. Ogden and I have, this mentor, Nancy Zafras, in common. And she visited one of my classes one time. And Nancy, well, I loved her, and people were often afraid of her. And so she came to visit this MFA class where I was teaching, and someone asked her about endings. And I remember she just said, "Endings are easy. Go back and read your story. It's in there," like boom. And I said, "They're not easy. They are the hardest thing." And so this story, All Boy, I could not end it. And I knew that what I had written was not the ending, but I kept trying to convince myself. So I'd send it out, and of course I'd get it back with, the ending's not quite right. Yes, I know that. And so the ending, it's the story of this boy. And at the end, his father is leaving the family to be with a man. He's not telling his son that, but the ending is basically the father telling him he's leaving. So that is the sort of scene that invites all sorts of cliches, right? Sad ending, father leaving son. And so nothing I wrote was right. It just always seemed kind of, it was either going to be sentimental or it just felt cliched. And so that at some point along the way, I mean, this went on for 6 months, but at some point I read this article in the Yale Review, and it was an economics article. And I do not usually read economics articles. And the article was about how people will work harder to not lose something than they will to gain something. And they had done all these tests with monkeys and found the same thing to be true with monkeys. If they gave them the option to gain something, that was not something they were as interested in as losing something, that it brings out a stronger emotion to think about losing than it does gaining. So the father in the story was a banker, and I suddenly realized I'm thinking about this wrong. I'm thinking, like, the question I've been asking is, how does the father tell his son he's leaving? But then I thought, maybe the question is really, how does a banker tell his son he's leaving? Like, that's the question to ask, because we're all much more than just one thing. And I know that I am someone, especially in moments where the emotion is really high, I deflect, I find a way to not quite say what I really need to say. And so this was an emotion I understood completely, was saying goodbye in economics terms rather than, like, you're my son that I love, goodbye. And that was, so it was so nice to find all my notes. In fact, when I was waiting to come on to the Zoom, I Googled and I found the article and read it again, because I was like, this is the article that saved my story. But it was just that little sort of thing. Sometimes I realize I can't write something or I can't finish it because there's something I just don't know yet. Something I don't understand about the world. There's an experience I haven't had yet. So I'm looking through the chat. Yes, John said that punishment sounds a lot like internalized systemic homophobia. Yes, John, that was exactly the story I ended up writing because I realized that that's definitely. When writing about LGBTQ characters, do you find yourself held back sometimes by the opinions of others? Almost like the judgment creates a block of creativity. How do you move past that? Logan, that's a really wonderful question. And John asks kind of a follow-up to that. How has the shifting landscape around LGBTQ acceptance affected you and your work? Yeah, the story I was just talking about, All Boy, about the father, that was a story that it started really with a colleague of mine at that fly-by-night ESL school. We were sitting in the faculty room one day, and we were talking about babysitters we'd had as kids. She said that she had a babysitter who used to always lock them in the closet. And the parents knew, but the parents didn't fire her until she used the father's toothbrush. Like that was the intimacy that the father could not bear. And that really intrigued me. So I split those two and I took the whole locking in the closet, and that became the beginning of this story, All Boy. But I did not know that that was a story about being in the closet. And I think had I known that that was a story about being in the closet, I would never have dared to go so directly into that symbolism, right? I mean, now I look at it. In fact, I was going to read from it when I was originally planning to teach the class about beginnings. I was going to read that beginning because that beginning is so much about, about being locked in a closet, which is what the story really was. And I thought, okay, we can talk about the symbolism there. The truth is, I would have run in fear had I known that that was what that story was going to be about. I think, one of the things that I like to kind of go back to these questions that Logan and John are asking, one of the things that frustrated me, I've always written about LGBTQ themes and LGBTQ characters at a time when that was not so easy to do. And I've just continued on. But one of the things that always frustrated me was this idea that people had that if you were doing LGBTQ, you had to be writing about coming out of the closet, as though that's the only thing that gay people do, is come out of the closet. And the other thing that frustrated me was this idea that if you were writing an LGBTQ character, they somehow couldn't do anything wrong. And that becomes very limiting. I understand where those impulses come from, especially, along the, kind of as we think about people's shifting acceptance of LGBTQ people. But for me, that's, as a writer, that's a very limiting idea to think that I can write a character who can't do anything wrong, who can't make mistakes, who can't. So that was one of the things that I've really had to give myself permission to do. And I think that's a little bit what you're maybe asking about, Logan, this idea of judgment and creativity. Because my work is read not just by LGBTQ people. And so, yes, of course, it's something I'm thinking about, but I have made the decision that my characters are going to be characters like all of us who make mistakes, and those mistakes are what fuel the story.
And just to let you know, Lori, we have about 5 to 7 minutes left with you.
Okay, so we can keep discussing and talking about questions that people have. I can read a little bit. I am open to doing anything at this point that seems like it would be helpful. I'm happy to talk about if there's another story that people read and they want to talk about that, or I'm
Looks like people are enjoying the questions with this wonderful master class with you, Lori. So I would say we keep on going there. And Elijah just posted a question about making characters believable. Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
you have great characters in your stories, so that's a great question.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that that's a huge question, but I think that um, I'm going to look back at some of the things that, because it was certainly one of the things that I was thinking about. Where did I put some of the things that I wrote down to talk about? But so many of the notes that I make are just, I realize when I look at them, are about the way that people intrigue me, like the things that we notice about people. And one of the notes that I came across, and it's one of my favorites. It was about a friend. She died a couple of years ago. But a group of us were out. So she was this like really tough, no nonsense butch woman from the South, like just no nonsense. And we were all out at dinner one night at a Chinese restaurant, and she took out her the chopsticks, the wooden ones that come in the little package and you break them apart. And so she's talking away, and she opens them up and she just starts scratching her back with them and then goes back to eating with them. And I went home, like I went into the bathroom. I took the wrapper and I went into the bathroom and wrote on the wrapper that she had done that, because I just thought, I do not want to forget that she used the chopsticks to, and that is the sort of detail for me, like that a character will explode around that. Because when I think of her, for me, someone who just like doesn't care, no nonsense, like who will just use the chopsticks and keep talking. And so for me, it's those small details that allow me to kind of first start drilling down on a character. Jay asked about Clara's cake and what inspired that story. That story is for me, I don't know how many people read that. I worried about that story because it's a story about a creative writing class, and people always said, all right, about creative writing classes. I have not spent a lot of time in creative writing classes as a student because I didn't do an MFA. But I took a creative writing class years ago in the town I told you about where I went to college. And I was very shy. And the class, I think this was a good thing, but the class was open to the community. So it wasn't just people from the university in the class. It was also just people could sign up and come in and take it, which was wonderful, but very intimidating for me because I was, 19 or 20 years old. And but that was kind of thinking back on that class and how that class played out for me, and how I was trying, I guess, to find in some ways a metaphor for the uncertainty I had felt for so many years about myself. And that just seemed to be the way to do it. Yeah, Jay says that it was a mirror to our own writing workshops. Um, that was a story I once read for a writing thing, and it was at a bar. And so in the bar were also like a bunch of old men just hanging out. And that story actually got the old men to listen and start laughing. So I thought, okay, maybe that story is not just for a group of people who've taken writing classes. Gabriana asks, in Just Another Family, how did you approach writing Sybil's complex narrative voice to convey her desire to escape from her family's craziness? So that's a very complicated question, but that story, there are three stories that were really written. There was a period in my life where I quit writing for about 2 years. It's the pandemic, and we had adopted a young woman. She was 14 when she came to us, and just trying to keep her afloat during the pandemic. The pandemic was it was a hard time. So I'd stopped writing. And there was a period where I thought maybe I'm not a writer. Maybe I won't write again. And when I came out of that period, I went back to Just Another Family, which was much, much shorter at that point, and I had no idea what it was about. That's what I'd realized. You don't know what this is about, just put it away. And I just started writing. And a lot of those stories were um, my own stories. Like my father made us eat glass one time. My mother, I just remember her outside trying to clean all the glass off of this steak because my father said, we were not going to waste good food. And so we ate it. And so a lot of those stories were just kind of the stories but for me, that story was very much, when I think back on it, I think my wife always says that narrator, people think it's you, but it's not you because you left and not made peace, because you don't ever just make peace with something, you keep making peace with it, but you don't have anger or regret, right? You're living the life that you want to live. But that other possibility of what my life might have been like if I hadn't made certain decisions, it's always right there. And I think Just Another Family came out of that. Um, Someone who read the story, my publicist had sent me some early little reviews from early readers. And one of them said what they most liked about the story was that the narrator kind of reveals herself to be a little bit of an asshole. And I love that because I was like, yeah, she kind of is. I mean, and by that, I think the person just meant that um, she's complicit in this. She's not a victim. Like, that's the thing about family dynamics, is that everyone is doing their thing. Certainly in that story, that was the case. That story is a story that I've heard from a lot of readers about. And I think the whole idea of not being our best selves around family resonates with a lot of people. And I think that's why, and to kind of throw a gender specific twist on it, I would say that probably 75% of the readers I've heard from have been men, and they have just felt, I think it hit close to home for them, and they felt that they didn't know, that they felt they were not their best selves when they would go to their families, and they were embarrassed that their spouses were witnessing it. So we're just about out of time. Elijah, oh, thank you, Elijah. I loved reading these. I've just been trying to go back. If I get quiet for a moment, it's because I'm reading your notes.
That's a
And
great comment from Elisha, because I
yeah,
think it's one of the hardest things to do when you're writing characters is they don't just appear that moment that you put them on the page. Like, they have to come fully into
yeah.
the story or into the plot. Uh,
Yeah. I think, Elijah, to kind of add to that even a little bit more, I think that we believe as writers that our readers need to know a whole bunch more before we can, like we've got to tell them this, this, and this. And really what they want is that feeling of like, okay, it starts right now, but they have all their lives behind them. And those fissures and, who they are is going to start bubbling up as the story goes on. But we don't need to tell them all that. We just get them in there and get going. So thank you. This has been really wonderful to read all of your comments and to be here with everyone today. So thank you both, Professors Ogden and Stubblefield, for having me, and thank all of you for your notes.
Wonderful.
That
Thank you
was
so much.
great.
Yeah, I will go ahead and stop our recording now. Okay, there we go.
Bye. Okay, well, I am going to thank you, everyone. So good luck with the rest of the class today and the rest of that. How far along are you in the
We're in week 4, is it? And we have one
Yeah, week 4.
and
writer
you have
next week.
6 weeks?
Yeah, next week we have a visiting playwright, Franz Luce Benson, will be with us at noon. So everybody is welcome back, and we'll be live streaming that as well. But yeah, everybody's working on their short stories this week, and
Oh, good. Oh,
Yeah.
perfect. So yay, short stories.
yeah, so
So, okay.
thank
Well,
you. We
thank
appreciate
you.
it so much.
Thank
We
you
love
very much.
love
Bye,
your class,
everyone.
and we'll be in touch. Bye. Bye, everyone.